I'm getting too old to be out walking this late. It really puts things in perspective for me. I've lived a long, good life, but now I don't have much time left to me, even as this day is little time left before the darkness falls. It makes me think about my legacy, and what will happen to everything when I'm gone. Let's see here. In spite of our estrangement during the war, William is my son, and I ought to leave something to him. I mustn't forget my dear sister Jane. I have so many nephews and nieces, and of course there are numerous educational establishments here in Philadelphia whose efforts I support wholeheartedly. But I think I shall leave most of my possessions to my daughter Sarah and her husband Richard, with Richard's inclusion being contingent upon his freeing his last slave. It's strange to think about, isn't it, that a bold new nation like ours still keeps slaves. It says right there in that document we sent the king back in 1776, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Young Jefferson certainly has quite a flair for the right turn of phrase. And I should know, because I was his editor. There were only a few small phrases in the whole Declaration that I thought were out of place, but the rest, sheer brilliance. Of course, the others then went and mutilated it, but where was I? Oh, yes. I think that we all knew deep down that slavery didn't really fit with what we were trying to create here in these United States. Jefferson tried to include a passage attacking the slave trade, before the committees got to him. And I think that General Washington always had some doubts as well. But the Southerners were insistent. They said that if there was no slavery, their economy would collapse, and they would take the rest of us with them. Well, maybe they're right, but I never believed that. For years, I felt that slavery was wrong economically, even before I realized it was wrong morally as well. Now, the South can make all the noise it wants about how abolishing slavery is impossible, but I said it was believed that rebelling against England wasn't possible either. And look where we are now. The Revolution showed us that the impossible becomes possible when man is willing to put forth his courage and a great deal of effort. Now, for most of my life, I've been as a man who stands in favor of compromise, wherever and whenever it is possible. Contrary to the opinion of certain individuals, John Adams, you really are far too sour for a man your age. This is not because I have no moral values, but because one of my most strongly held values is that we all have more in common with ourselves and our interests than we realize. He that cannot bear with other people's passions cannot govern his own. So why then am I taking such an uncompromising stand here? It's complicated. And it started when I was a boy, though I did not realize it then. As a young man, I worked as an apprentice printer under my older brother James. He was so much older than me that we were never close, and he treated me more like a servant than a brother or an apprentice. James knew that I had some talent in writing, but he would not print anything that I wrote. He felt threatened by me. He even forced me to sign various documents binding myself totally to his service. And so, at a young age, I learned what it was like to be in a situation where one is powerless and cannot escape, save by running very far away. And that's what I did, of course, and how I came here to Philadelphia. I found a new master printer and was set up on my own with my own paper within a few years. I was quite successful, but then it wasn't really that hard. After all, my only competition in the newspaper trade was in the process of serializing a complete encyclopedia in alphabetical order. All I had to do was be somewhat livelier, and my success was assured. I must confess that I hardly gave slavery a thought for some time afterwards. I had become a powerful man by then. I even owned a handful of slaves myself over the years. Like many, I justified myself by saying that the African was intellectually inferior to the European and needed proper guidance if he was to make anything of himself. I even wrote some essays that supported that view, though never slavery itself. But then some friends of mine started a school for the children of freed slaves, and they wanted my help in financing it. I gave it, being a firm believer in the value of education, And then one day I visited the school myself, and I found, much to my surprise and ultimate betterment, that these children were entirely as calm, intelligent, and eager to learn as any I had met. It came to me then that if, in fact, our black slaves are in any way inferior, it is in education and opportunity rather than inherent nature. The institution of slavery ought to be impossible to justify when this is considered, but some will always find a way. After that, I wrote some few articles on how unstable it is to be completely reliant upon a slave workforce that has every reason to hate you, but I'm afraid to say I became so very busy in defending the rights of free colonists that I paid very little effort to the plight of the slaves. And then came the Revolution, and I spent many years overseas as ambassador to France. When I returned to the New World, I took part in the Constitutional Convention. Now, if ever there was a time to do something about slavery, that was it. The problem, as usual, was that the Southern delegates simply weren't interested in compromising with anyone. They felt that by becoming free from England, they had become free from all restrictions and could do whatsoever they pleased. Rutledge even threatened to walk out of the convention and take the Carolinas with him if there was the slightest hint of slavery being abolished. To keep the Union, such as it was, together, those of us who actually cared about slavery had to keep quiet. After it was all over, though, I knew it was time to do something. Now, I've always found satire to be both a very effective tool and a great deal of fun. And so I published an anonymous piece wherein I created a fictitious African named Sidi Mehmet and had him pontificate about how wonderful the enslavement of white Europeans is due to their barbaric ways and mental inferiority. Are not Spain, Portugal, France, and the Italian states ruled by despots who hold all their subjects in slavery without exception? Even England treats its sailors as slaves. Is their condition then made worse by their falling into our hands? Now, the real joke was that everyone thought it was serious. Many of the Southern slaveholders attacked Sidi's arguments without ever realizing that if you replace European with African in his speech, his arguments are exactly the same as their own. In other men we faults can spy, and blame the mote that dims their eye. Each little speck and blemish find, to our own stronger errors, blind. It was enough to bring a smile to this old man's face. After I'd had my fun, it was time to get serious. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society sent a petition to Congress on how to end slavery in an expedient manner that would protect the rights of everyone involved and keep the economy from falling in on itself at the same time. Attention to emancipated black people is therefore to be hoped to become a branch of our national policy. But insofar as we continue to promote that emancipation, it remains a serious duty incumbent upon us, which we mean to discharge to the best of our judgment and ability. I must confess I was rather proud of that plan. After all, I wrote it. And since it had my signature at the top, Congress couldn't just ignore it like they did with all the other slavery bills and petitions and what have you. Of course, they did not actually adopt my plan, not that I had ever really expected them to. But what I did accomplish was to make slavery a national issue. As one of the leaders of the revolution had taken such a strong stand on the issue, it could never be easily swept under the carpet again. So, after all this, it's obvious, really, why I can't in good conscience give my son-in-law Richard anything unless he first shows he is able to respect a man's natural rights and give him his freedom. Well now, look at the time. I've quite gotten away from myself, and this gout of mine has begun to object to my staying up. I had best be getting home. Old man needs his sleep, after all. And, as I always say, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise.